This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. It's Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I'm here today with a very special guest, Dr. Gregory Cochran. He has a Twitter, and he has a blog, West Hunt. And today we are going to be talking about natural selection in Western Eurasia, natural selection in the genome. We will be talking first, we're talking simultaneously, but really first we'll talk about Ali Akbari's paper, Ancient DNA Reveals Pervasive Directional Selection Across Western Eurasia. We'll talk about that, but we are going to go back, and this is a topic that I actually wanted to talk to Greg about for a couple of years now. I've talked about this. Do a retrospective on 10,000 Year Explosion, his book that he wrote in 2009, or published in 2009. Obviously the ideas are a little older, and he co-wrote it with the late Henry Harpending, and it also integrates some of his Greg's ideas that were articulated in the paper with John Hawkes about accelerating evolution. What year was that paper again?
2007, I think.
You've been, on this recent acceleration of human adaptive evolution with Hawkes, Wang, Cochran, and Moises. That was 2007 in PNAS. So anyway, that's the context. I guess we should just start. So the Reich Lab paper, I've done a podcast about it, and by the time this is published or posted, you will have read my piece in the free press about the paper. Although, you're going to hear a lot more technical detail in this conversation than in that piece because, the audience is different. Anyway, so Ancient DNA Reveals Pervasive Directional Selection Across Western Eurasia, published April 15th, 2026. As most of you know, this has been a paper that was in the works for 8 years. And, it's something we knew the Reich Lab was going to do because of, there was, when you download their data, you sign an agreement that you don't, publish original stuff on selection. So they were clearly doing that. So it's the outcome of that. It made a huge press splash, even though the preprint's been out for a couple of years. This has been at conference presentations also for years. I heard about this paper from people in Rasmus Nielsen's lab in 2020, not the paper, but the research. And at that point, they were already joking that it was, they've been hearing about it for a couple of years. So yeah, that makes sense because I think Akbari said 8 years have been working on it. So 2 years in, people are making fun of it for being late. And now it's 2026, obviously, 6 years after that. So it's finally out. And, it's a pretty good paper. It's pretty comprehensive. Introduces new methods and all that stuff. So I've been talking about this. I think you guys have heard my piece. Greg, both you and John Hawkes actually have been talking about this. And I will probably link to, maybe I'll talk to John separately, but I'll link to his essay or his post on his Substack. But tell me what you think, how you're feeling about this paper, and then in the context of the work that it didn't or did cite. And also, I should say the guest on this podcast, David Piefer, who has a Substack that I've linked to, and I think many of you have read, has also been complaining that they did not cite prior work. They did not cite his work with Emil Kierkegaard and others on directional selection using somewhat different methods, coarser, less robust methods, but whatever, it is what it is. So there's that kind of media scientific ethics controversy that's going on. So with that, Greg, take it away.
It's definitely an interesting paper, but I think one of the interesting points is that there were other ways of knowing some of the conclusions, which is one reason I came to somewhat similar conclusions quite a while ago. And those ways seem to be invisible to a lot of people in human genetics.
Well, so what do you mean? What sort of ways are you talking about? I mean, I kind of know, but let's articulate for the listener.
Well, here's a particular example. Maybe the strongest selection they found was basically a lot of selection on pathogen defenses in this paper. Things like, think of it as some are specific things against specific infectious diseases, probably, but others you would say sort of a general upregulation of the immune system, making things, turning the volume up on immune defenses. And I would say that it was possible to know that had happened in places like Europe some time ago. Let's say 50 years at least. It was easy to know that. But I don't think most people in human genetics did know it.
Yeah. Well, so the context is, I think, with human genetics, when we're talking about this, a lot of people in human genetics, they come out of medical genetics, and they're studying probands, and they're studying pedigrees. They're not thinking about selection. They're thinking about how do you identify a genetic locus for a disease. So that is, if you go to the American Society of Human Genetics meetings, American Society of Human Genetics is half MDs, half geneticists. So, the medical aspect of genetics is really, really dominant in human genetics historically. And the evolutionary aspect has not been as dominant. Evolutionary geneticists have tended to work in Drosophila and stuff like that. So Drosophila geneticists or animal breeders, agricultural geneticists, quantitative geneticists, they also understand selection, right? But human geneticists tend not to.
That's certainly part of it. But part of what I'm talking about is something you would have thought the medical types would know. Like a simple example. Like when the Spaniards show up in the New World, Indians start dying like flies.
Yeah.
Diseases that were, let's say, serious in Europe become much more serious and much more deadly in affecting people in the Americas and in other isolated populations. And that isn't a secret, and it's kind of a medical story, but apparently nobody knew it. Or at least the people involved in this sort of thing didn't know it, and I don't think you could make them know it. It's a strange story, but it's spectacular. I mean, it shows up as a historical factor, but they act as if it is not true. I mean, to the point where if you have a certain place in medicine where people are taking account of some such difference, they're all people trying to make sure you don't.
Yeah. So as medicine, human genetics, people are ignoring this stuff. So, I mean, obviously, well, someone like Nick Patterson, we're just going to name some people, so the authors, Ali Akbari, Annabelle Perry, Alison Barton, Mohammed Reza Karimajad, Stephen Ghazal, Zhang Li, Yating Zhang, Alyssa Mitnick, Nick Patterson, Matthew Ma, Zhang Zhao, Alkis Price, Eric Lander, Ron Panalsi, Nadine Rowland, Sohan Malik, and David Wright. I mean, Nick Patterson knows about selection, right? I mean, so it's like there are people in this list we know about selection, though. But in terms of like the literature review and the introduction, it's very genomics focused. It's very paleogenomic focused. It's basically, how can paleogenomics tell us about selection? If this was, I don't know, if Ali Akbari is going to write a book, which I don't think he is, but if he was going to write a book, though, I don't think he would write it just about this paper, right? Like it would be a more thorough introduction.
I don't know. I haven't met the guy. I'd like to sometime. I mean, I've talked to some of these other people, not to Alec Berry. I think that it's as if there's just whole areas of relevant knowledge that are never referred to, never. For example, like they use PRS scores for, say, IQ, but they never use IQ, except in that sense. I mean, there are people have actually given IQ tests to people. We kind of had to do that in order to get things like PRS scores, but everything in that kind of work has been really energetically ignored.
Yeah.
Scores that people actually get in different parts of the world, things like that. It's the only thing I've ever seen anybody do in this kind of genetics is deny that it exists.
Yeah. So PRS, polygenic risk score, and just to be clear, that basically means that you look at the genes and you total up what the predicted phenotype is based just on the genes instead of like measuring them, right? And so they're getting PR. Yeah.
Of course, somebody had to have done lots of tests and then do statistical checks to see how the genes affected those test results. I mean, here we have PRS scores, but there are no IQ tests, or there are no IQ test results. And if they exist, they have to be ignored. I mean, completely.
Yeah.
It's weird. But I mean, to the extent that how much of the things that are their results, and I'm not talking about genetic details, because for the most part, we did not know those, although we know a few of them perhaps. But the general trends were already known, or if you thought about it for, like 3 minutes, you would have come to a similar conclusion on a lot of it. I think that's interesting. I don't think it's the only interesting question, but I think it's interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, so what do you think, real quickly? Some people like Sasha Gusev and earlier Graham Coop, back when the preprint was new, have talked about they don't believe in the robustness of the methods to control for, various things. What do you think about that? Like in terms of population structure or whatever?
I think take those two guys and have them teach an AP calculus course to some pure-blooded Australian Aborigines.
All right. There we go.
For the next 5 years.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair enough. Okay. All right. So, what do you think about, David's complaints that they're not citing people? I mean, I think you have that complaint too. So probably to some extent. I don't know.
In a better world, people might cite things. It's up to them. I don't expect much.
Yeah.
I could go on, but I don't expect much. I also know that they are sort of, to some extent, navigating, political currents and so forth. And, and that's just the most fascinating and wonderful thing to me in the world. And I certainly spend all my time trying to think of how to do similar things. I mean, it's probably necessary if you want to run a big lab and get money. But it ends up with you saying things like, I am paraphrasing, check me for accuracy, in Reich's book, when he was talking about, we're going to find that populations are different, even in things like psychological stuff, and it's foolish to pretend that isn't so, but they'll probably be the opposite differences of what we think.
Yeah. You're talking
what he said, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's bullshit. And as such, it sort of offends me. By the way, will there be surprises? Oh, yeah. Well, but will we end up that, like if Group X consistently shows a certain difference that, detailed genetic investigation will show it's really in the opposite direction? Well, it hasn't happened yet. And it's inherently kind of improbable. But, when you deliberately lie, that's kind of going to be an improbable statement. And of course, that was a deliberate lie on Reich's part. I understand. Yeah. I think I understand why, but I think there's no other way to characterize it.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, what do you think? How likely is it going to be that, the people with the greatest genetic potential for height are, let's say, the pygmies? I don't think so.
Well, okay, so with pygmies, with the height stuff, though, at least, that is, resolved in terms of, the more, there have been admixture analyses where, the more pygmy ancestry someone has, the shorter they are, in West Africa.
With Bantu ancestry, because there is
there is a mixture.
Yeah, sure.
And so you're explicitly correcting for, it's basically Yeah. So I mean, we know the pygmies are short because some people have like said stupid things like, "Oh, the pygmies are short because they're oppressed." Like I don't know. So, there have been anthropologists that have said things like that. Oh, they're short because they're marginalized. Well, no. It's the pygmies that are taller have more Bantu ancestry,
Sure.
and vice versa, right? And so,
Well, there have been, and mixture studies are a way to look at some of these differences in which you don't have the same concerns about portability of PRS scores and so forth. And and they're fairly often done for medical purposes. And they're occasionally done for forbidden purposes. But when they do, they all come up with the answer that, oh, yeah, well, you're between these two groups, and the closer you are to one in your admixture, on the whole, the closer you are to the phenotype. So, I mean, and a fair amount is known about that, but, I don't get the impression that that's ever mentioned in any of this sort of work either.
Yeah.
But it's simpler to do than to do, the various sorts of corrections and check, trying to look for selection itself and not admixtures of different groups, although those differences too were generated by selection because, essentially everybody outside of Africa has common ancestry generally no later than about 50,000 years ago.
Yeah. That would be the latest.
And sometimes a lot more recently. So, for example, one of the players in this study, one of the groups, we have basically three groups making up the ancestors of Europeans. We have the early farmers from the Middle East, EEF. We have the steppe peoples, the Indo-Europeans. But before that, we had hunter-gatherers occupying Europe. But those hunter-gatherers are not people who have been in Europe for 50,000 or 40 or 30,000 years. They're largely descended from groups in probably Anatolia more like, 15,000 years ago. Not, they're, a major source. So, for example, the time to the last common ancestry of the hunter-gatherers and the farmers coming in is not a really long time. I mean, they seem to have common roots, maybe 6,000 years earlier, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Why are they different?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing we know is that the farmers have basal Eurasian, right?
True.
Which the Mesolithic populations they didn't have it, or they had it much lower levels if they had it, right? So that is interesting. But basically, the Mesolithic, so the Villabrina cluster that you're talking about, the Villabrina cluster seems to have emerged from the Balkans / Anatolia at some point in the Pleistocene, at some point after the last glacial maximum. So there were people, in that region that didn't have basal Eurasian, but there were other people in Anatolia there's a sample out of the Caucasus, like 30,000 years ago, or something like 20, or maybe like 20-some thousand years ago. Zaduna, I think, is what it's called. The paper there's a preprint. The paper never got published. It was basically all the info and the data was just moved into other papers, but it shows that individual had basal Eurasian ancestry. 25, 30,000 years ago in the Middle East. So, it seems like they were absorbed earlier in an Apache way into different populations. But yeah, so I mean, these are the European populations that you have. I think one of the fascinating things, and I haven't gotten into this, is they partitioned the results also in some of their charts between Mesolithic foragers, Neolithic farmers, and Yamnaya steppe pastoralists. And then you see sometimes, for example, with like intelligence, it goes up with the Neolithic and then it drops back with that Yamnaya before going back up, right?
Right. And what I think is going on, although I think I'd put it as a pretty likely explanation, is that a lot of this has to do with how long you've been farming. Now, with the with the EEF coming in, they had already been farming for a while before, they were farmers when they came to Europe, but they had been farming for several thousand years before that in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Not enormous, less than 10, but perhaps as much as 4 or 5,000 years.
Yeah.
in the beginnings of farming. Whereas, for example, it looks a lot like the Indo-Europeans were pretty close to, they really had probably not done more than about, very small amount of farming. They're basically a bunch of hunter-gatherers who, and fishermen, more specifically, that ended up becoming pastoralists.
Yeah. That sounds
which is, by the way, I think it's somehow an easier thing for people to switch to.
Yeah. Well, this was true with Australian Aborigines. They got involved in becoming shepherds pretty easily.
I would say something like that was probably true of the Turks and Mongols as well.
Yeah.
They went straight from being hunters to being herdsmen.
Yeah, well, I mean, they went from hunters to herdsmen. They also had they had some millet farming going on, but what we know about the Mongols, like Genghis Khan, his life, there was a period where he was a forager, and then they used to call, I think the Merkids tribe did a lot of foraging. They called them rat eaters, partly just because they hunted so many, I guess, rodents. I don't know, but yeah. So I mean, so that's definitely interesting to see in the data, and I think you would have anticipated. Let's actually I want to ask you real quick, and then we'll go to 10,000 a year because I want to talk about it chapter by chapter. They're not that many chapters, but so we got 7 chapters. So David Piefers complains. What do I know that you said that you don't, people don't cite. That just happens. Do you think he's got some legitimate complaints?
Some people don't cite, but I mean, in some areas you don't have the political. We don't want to cite those naughty people problems. Although there's more to it than that, because, for example, when Hawks and I wrote that paper saying that it was very likely that we had mixed with Neanderthals and some of the alleles would probably be advantageous and would have been selected, we got very few cites from people you would have thought would have. I think there is, and I don't think that one was politically very sensitive.
Yeah.
I think there's just a lot of people who don't cite if you're not part of the right club and there's other things which are sort of alien to me, but they're probably the way things are, which is in biology, most of biology, predictions of things are not considered even meaningful.
Yeah.
Whereas in physics, it's very much different. And by the way, I will say clearly, better, not just different. Biology tends to not much believe in theory, even when it has a correct theory, which is it's a mistake. There's not much positive to be said about it, but they don't. So that maybe that's part of it. Maybe a theoretical prediction isn't considered. I mean, I don't think it's considered to be anything at all. I certainly have had certain people say, well, yeah, you predicted X and it was true, and you predicted Y and it was true, and you predicted Z and it was true, but those are all just coincidences.
So I guess the first thing I want to talk about is Chapter 2, The Neanderthal Within. And this came out in 2009. I don't know if you could have timed it better because the Neanderthal introgression admixture paper, I think it was in Science, came out in the spring of 2010, which basically established there were still people that were talking about ancient population structure and other things, but basically established to most people's certainty that there was Neanderthal admixture. You had been writing, actually, you had been writing and talking about this along with John for actually many years before 2009.
Well,
you wrote about
several years. I mean,
yeah,
probably no more than 10, a little less than 10.
I mean,
something like that. But we were not the only people who ever said that it was likely. There was certainly a current of thought going back a long time saying it probably would have happened, although there were probably more people. Certainly the majority of people in human genetics said the opposite. But we weren't the first people to ever say it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. So let's talk about so this is a prediction. This is a prediction. That's well, it was like confirmed almost immediately, like pretty soon afterwards. So the key I will say is there were people like Jeff Wall and others, besides your group, besides you, and John and Henry Harpending, who had written about this sort of stuff and the likelihood using genomic data. And I think Magnus Nordberg showed how the early mitochondrial work that showed Neanderthals were an outgroup could not actually refute the proposition of admixture because, it's a single locus and all these things. You're expecting a certain level of drift. There was a lot of theoretical reasons why, admixture was possible. And I want to reiterate for the listener, the reason that we know that or we think it likely happened is, well, we actually got that Neanderthal genome. And it turns out, Eurasians or non-Africans, their genome resembles Neanderthals more than Africans' genomes resemble Neanderthals. And one of the number one ways that could be is they got Neanderthal ancestry, about a couple of percent. Although
in like Patterson's calculations, it was only about 40 standard deviations more likely. But go ahead, that there had been such a mixture into people outside Africa. That was a fun moment. I can tell you one fun thing that happened in 2010. There was a conference in Albuquerque, which is one of the very few types of conferences I go to. And not even then half the time. But John and I were there, and there were people. It started leaking because there were people reviewing the paper. This was slightly before the publication in Nature.
Yeah.
And it's fair to say we were enjoying ourselves.
Yeah. I will say, okay, so, and this was the one that a lot of people also did say that of the various things that you're saying in 10,000 Year Explosion, this was the one that got like the most assent though, in terms of that's quite likely, right?
Well, it had already been done. In terms of people saying it was likely, a lot of people said it was likely after they already knew it had happened. That's good, actually. But I know the general sorts of things that people in human genetics were saying, and they were who mostly did not think it, and I thought they were rather silly. But I could expand on that a little bit. I can also tell you, why we thought it was clear that it was extremely likely it would have happened. And it wasn't that complicated an argument. Basically, I would say the key part was saying that we have a lot of information on how long two mammal populations need to split before typically you start having serious fertility problems. Sister species that had a common ancestry X ago, how big does X have to be before it's fairly difficult to have offspring? And the answer, and this is something that it varies. There's some animals that will surprise you. They've separated longer than you think, but it's about, roughly speaking, 2 million years. And it was pretty clear that Neanderthals had not, from the fossil record, that Neanderthals had not split that long ago. More like, 600,000, 800,000, something like that.
Yeah.
So I said, what are the odds that there'll be mutual fertility? They said, I don't know, 90%. Very likely. But then there were the funny parts of it. Since I saw various people say humans wouldn't have done anything that disgusting. I love those people. I would like to hear them talk more because they're funny. So there were people saying, well, Neanderthals look too different and they were weird, so people wouldn't have had sex with them. And I remember thinking, you don't get out much, do you? You've never been in a bar at 1 o'clock in the morning. You've never even been drunk. So I thought those people were fun. There were other people who had various comments such as, well, I remember a certain Nobel Prize winner who was saying, well, even if there was a little bit of admixture, it probably wouldn't have been genetically significant. That was Svante Pääbo. But that's because that was wrong, but that's because he doesn't know any population genetics at all. Even if you had a 1% admixture, that gives enormous numbers of opportunities for favorable. That means many copies of each favorable gene have been injected into the other group. There's a fair chance, if they really are favorable, they have a reasonable chance of spreading, a computable chance. This was something figured out by Haldane. It's sort of like Haldane back in 1927. It's kind of like it's very similar to the chance of a favorable new mutation happening spontaneously, except that there's typically many more than one copy being transferred. So the phrase that Fisher used for whether a favorable gene, when you suddenly get 40 copies of it in your population, if it succeeds, he said it's a racing certainty. But most of the people at that time, this has gotten better, but most of the people at that time who were doing human genetics did not know very much population genetics. This was a somewhat different time. If we go back to, say, the year 2000, it was routine for people doing human genetics to know nothing about that at all, or to know things that were false. That has gotten a lot better. I mean, in 2000, people would make jokes about it. Like, what do you call a professor of population genetics?
It was emeritus. I remember
emeritus, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody said, well, real biologists are doing molecular biology.
Yeah.
I mean, and certainly nobody was thinking very hard about things like selection. And in fact, the consensus, for some reason I will never understand, in human genetics was that selection, was something that happened off stage long ago and far away. They didn't really believe in it. I mean, there's 2 or 3 reasons for that, and I think I know most of them, but they're all terribly, ridiculously stupid. But go ahead.
No, I mean, people were just really fixated on molecular genetics back in the day, right?
There is there's lots to learn from it. There's nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't make all the other issues go away.
Yeah.
But the people would argue about it. People who were medium smart would say, well, you don't really need, by the way, I would half agree with them. Well, we don't really need these guys talking about evolution because we're just going to go in and measure everything. That would have been, say, Watson talking to E.O. Wilson.
Yeah.
We're not going to need theorists.
Jim Watson.
I said, right. And but I said, well, I'm not actually sure how much we're going to need E.O. Wilson either, because if he's a theorist, we're doomed. Because he didn't know any population genetics either. But he believed, I wouldn't say he was always right, but he at least believed selection and also looking at actual animals and so forth in the natural world was important, which it certainly is. But he didn't have the math. But that was interesting. But there were all sorts of strange things running around, most of which are better today. There were people who took, again, this is 25 years ago, there were people who took Chimera's ideas about most of the genome being not, being close to neutral.
Yeah.
That there were many.
That there was that basically it was mostly like dominated by neutral forces, not selection.
Yeah, but phenotypes aren't. And some of us think that, whether you're alive and whether you can walk and think and, take a shit are actually important, even besides knowing your genome. But there were lots and lots of people who somehow took neutral theory to believe that selection was unimportant. I mean, ultimately, this means unimportant to phenotypes, unimportant to what happens. And those people who were a very strong force in 2000 were nuts.
Yeah.
And I thought it was totally obvious they were nuts. I said, look, did you just see this predatory bird come down at 180 miles an hour and knock another bird out of the air? I said, there's a lot of optimization there. That wasn't just drift that gave you a peregrine falcon. And I'm sure if I'd said that, they'd have just looked at me and thought, boy, you are an old-fashioned person. Uh, uh, I thought they were strange, and I still think they were strange. But there were a lot of other people who were not so much possessed by, a misunderstood kind of neutral theory.
Yeah.
They just didn't know anything about it at all. They came out of medical genetics, probably the most they had ever. I would guess that they'd had people talk about selection. They might have heard about selection in a genetics course for 1 week
Yeah.
in school. Am I being ridiculous about that? You've been.
No, I mean that's about right. Yeah, that's about right in terms of biological undergraduate education. From what I remember, the 1990s. Yeah, selection was just not, which is interesting or ironic maybe because the importance of evolutionary theory and the importance of selection and Darwin's original theory about the origin of species, right? Adaptation and selection.
It's only the stuff that makes biology make some sense rather than being a laundry list of interesting facts.
Yeah.
But what's my point? The guys coming in out of human medical genetics, what did they have going for them? We spend a lot of money on medicine. They probably had more money. They were kind of used to having more money. They probably had more institutional authority, I would say, on the whole, even though some of the people I would consider who did very good work in this were, they were people at prominent universities, but they weren't bringing in a lot of money. I mean, I don't think Leigh Van Valen was bringing in a lot of money. People, who had a pretty
the late Leigh Van Valen. Yeah, he was a brilliant thinker, but you're right. He was kind of he was a character. I will say that. I know people.
Oh yeah, but he was also interesting. I have read his stuff. I talked to him now once in a while back in the day. I would talk to him about some fashionable new idea, and he said, "They think that." But it was perfectly routine for famous people. All right, here is now. This is a part, probably not the biggest part of the story. John and I and some others, but it was originally John and me, came up with the idea that there was probably a big increase in the production by mutation of favorable variants when there's, say, 60 times as many people by, let's say, the early Bronze Age or something compared to hunter-gatherer days.
Yeah.
That is, I think I overemphasize that, but I don't think it's false. It is, as a causal element in this set of big changes, it did matter. It's not insignificant. On this Akbari paper, about a third of the variants driving these things are new.
Yeah. Yeah, they're new mutations, you mean. They're not just from standing variation. They're not from extant variation.
Standing variation is the other 2/3, and it's very important. But there are things that are new. And if you had done a similar genetic examination of people, let's say 100,000 years ago compared to 110,000 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that. You wouldn't have seen a third of the mutations being new because the population was small and kind of stable if you'd gone back a long time. So that was true. But John was once giving a talk in which we were excited about this and talking about there must have been, quite a bit of increase in the rate of production of of all mutations, but that also includes favorable mutations in recent millennia. And there was somebody in the audience who came up after the end of the talk and said, why would there be more mutations in a larger population? Now, I think that's actually pretty easy to explain or understand.
Yeah. Just like the raw number of mutations is going to go up just because the proportion is going to be the same, but you just multiply it by the number. Yeah.
And to be fair, the person who asked this question, I think he did understand after John explained to it. But I consider it kind of weird that Svante Pääbo would have to ask the question when dirt farmer relatives of mine would not.
Yeah.
But there's much goofier things than that. But coming out of medical genetics, the default amount, or in some sense, molecular biology, which was another current, the amount that they would know about selection, natural selection, the mathematics of it, the natural history facts of it, would be pretty much nothing.
Yeah.
Now, I think that got a lot better because people got this flood of data that's had very interesting things happening in it. And I think a lot of them, they learned a lot. Now, some of them learned it probably nearly instantaneously as soon as they realized there was a question. I think you can guess which ex-Irish chess champion I'm thinking of at this moment. I'm pretty sure that Nick Patterson, once he got thinking about, I need to learn something about selection, I think he went and learned it pretty fast.
Yeah.
And a lot of other people learned it reasonably fast. And a lot of other people, maybe more, I'm not sure they ever did. And if they did, they kind of, they don't like it, which is, it's sort of odd. But I don't think Kimura liked it. Which I said, now there is a sense in which nobody likes it, in which you said, well, the way that this population got tougher against problem X is vast numbers of people who were not very resistant to it died. That part is anybody could find uncomfortable. But Kimura, for example, apparently just didn't like the idea of natural selection. This probably meant he was pre-adapted to understanding that much of the genome is random.
Yeah.
Because he didn't like natural selection, which is, I don't know, it just strikes me as funny. But I think that's the case.
Yeah.
But I think people have gotten ever so much better at it, although still they can talk about it in strange ways. So if I were to hear somebody saying, well, it's probably, the amount of the genome that's involved in the lots of recent directional selection is probably only 2 or 3%, which is probably true. I mean, something like that, right? So it's not really significant. And I said, but there's another sense in which we might say, I could probably say the same thing. Let's say we're all the way up to 5% for the differences between Homo erectus and humans today. But I said, but, it's not just the number of differences, it's what they do. And which has been, ignored by all sorts of people when they talk about things like FST as a difference, the total genetic differences. I said, well, we're mostly interested in what the differences cause. I said, most, at least they're, most people, most of the time, they're interested in what happens as opposed to the ultimate roots of what happens. And I would say that's actually been a problem in general for people in this particular subfield is they have not put a whole lot of effort into, like when I mentioned, I want to give an example. I said people from long isolated populations respond differently to a given infectious disease than people whose ancestors have been through it for a long time. Okay. Even when the conditions are otherwise identical, the Faroe Islands, north of England, they're not visited tremendously. It was possible to go for a long time without catching some things, although every now and then a ship would bring it in. So there was a period of about 60 years in which they didn't have any measles.
Yeah.
And then they did, and 90% of them, the only people who didn't have measles were people over 60 who had already had it. Okay.
I see. Yeah. Resistant. Yeah.
And it was a fairly famous, well-documented case because they sent a young Danish doctor there to do all the numbers. And he ended up figuring out, the contagious period, how, the relevant numbers about measles from this, which, by the way, was interesting because during that exact moment, which was the 1840s or something, the medical schools barely believed that anything was contagious. But that's another story. But he documented it well. So they had this thing, 90% of the people got it. But how many died? And the answer was, I don't know. Not nothing. 2 or 3%.
Yeah.
Okay. Now there were other times, not too distant from this in time, where there was an epidemic of measles in Fiji.
Okay.
Again, in the 19th century, pretty well documented. And, everybody got it because nobody in Fiji had ever had measles before. None of their ancestors had had measles. So it races through, and again, practically everybody gets it. But there's a difference. It kills a third of everybody on the island.
Yeah.
And that number, like 33% versus 2%, that's a useful and interesting fact. I mean, depressing too, but it's real. And the people who have talked about differences between populations apparently are totally unaware of this this fact, which is tremendously shaped history, which is why are most people in Connecticut, other than that one tiny casino, why are there very few American Indians in Connecticut? And I said, it's pretty much because they all dropped dead of European diseases. And but why did that happen? I said, because there was a difference. Indians in those days were immunologically different from Europeans. They are less different now for two reasons. One, the average person who says he's an Indian in Connecticut would be 96% European. That's one way to get tougher. The second way is Indians changed. The most resistant people were the ones who lived. And the third reason, not counting RFK, is that we give people shots, and so you don't even have to get measles. But these differences have been quite huge. There's actually a small industry pretending they don't exist, where they come up with various kinds of bullshit explanations, talking about greenfield epidemics, things like that. And it's not that the American Indians were different. That's not why their population dropped 90%. It was some other long-winded piece of nonsense. The answer is, it is because they were different. Okay? I mean, or for that matter, when the British would put soldiers in West Africa, and say, again, maybe the middle of the 19th century, and half of them would die every year, it was because they were different from the local Africans. They had a lot more trouble with malaria than the local Africans, which is not to say the local Africans enjoyed malaria or that it wasn't risky, but it was less risky for them. And that sort of fact about human difference, you see, there are certain facts about human differences that people work at hiding, but, as far as I can tell, they work at hiding almost all of them. By the way, the Reich people have known about some of those for a long time in the course of their work, and they've learned more. One of the very early things that David Reich did was find out that this is unusual because it is all due to one gene.
Yeah.
Most things are very many. But Vivax malaria, the kind that you see more in temperate latitudes, typically people in the central parts of Africa can't get it at all. They're Duffy negative. There's this particular receptor molecule on the red blood cell that they just don't have. And that is the entryway for Vivax malaria, and they don't get it at all. I mean, other kinds of malaria they're more resistant to, but they're not totally immune. This one, pretty much totally immune. So he knew that, from his own work, that about some of these differences. Or another early thing that Reich did is there was a twofold increase in prostate cancer risk for black men compared to white men at essentially the same ages and so forth. And one of his early pieces of work was saying, well, is any of this genetic? Or is it caused by oppression or police brutality or whatever?
Yeah, there was some controversy about that at the time, actually. Now it wouldn't be a big deal, but
if you brought it up again, it would still be a big deal. People don't want to hear it. But it was all genetics. There were a few, by the way, it wasn't one gene, but it was a kind of limited cluster of things that increased prostate cancer risk. And I have wondered if there's not an interesting story behind that. I mean, perhaps those genes were involved in something else that is useful in Africa, but not everywhere. I don't know. I mean, I suspect there might be some more interesting things if you took a closer look at it. But Reich showed it was just a few genes that were essentially, the variants involved were unique to Africans, and that's where the extra risk came from. So he knows some of these things. Now, like medical records said, the risk for prostate cancer in American blacks, age-adjusted, et cetera, otherwise comparable, it's about twice as big. But, didn't his book suggest that, well, maybe it'll really turn out that Norwegians are more prone to prostate cancer? I said, well, it didn't. It was just the way it looked. I said, isn't that odd? A lot of things in this world are, I mean, at least in some sense, they were just there. I mean, what if I were to say that guys in Ireland were more prone to skin cancer than people in West Africa? It says, well, isn't it more complicated than saying they're just genetically paler? And the answer is no, that's pretty much it. By the way, I've had people argue that with me, which, is, one of the stronger things. Like, the worst places in the world are for skin cancer are places with lots of ultraviolet full of Irishmen, like certain parts of Australia up in Queensland or something. I mean, and, New Mexico has quite a bit of that too. We have clear skies, but we're also high altitude, so we get more ultraviolet, and skin cancer is kind of a common thing in New Mexico. But somehow it's not common among the Navajo. What is that? I said, probably because they're darker skinned and have better protection against it. But there are all sorts of people who said, well, it can't be that because I don't like it. I have never seen this attitude be good for anything at all.
Well, okay, so let's go back to the book in terms of why is agriculture so important? And the late L.L. Cavalli Forza, for him, he would always say, apparently during lab meetings, because I had some friends that were there, it's like he'd always be like, well, maybe it's agriculture. Can you talk about why it's so important in your book?
I talk a lot. I mean, I think I was right on some of what I said, probably not everything, and I'm sure there's more to the story we haven't completely figured out. But it looks like in this Alec Berry paper, and also if I cheat and look at the exterior world, that having had agriculture for, a significant amount of time, for example, I don't think if you had agriculture for the last generation, that has changed you very much. But the places where it's 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, it has. Okay. And in a bunch of ways. But now, the details here are speculative. It's going to be interesting to see if we can fill in the details. But the first thing is it's a very big change in your life to go from being a hunter-gatherer to a farmer. You tend to be running now. The population goes up a lot. You're running into more people than you did before. You're running into more people who are not close relatives than you did before. You have less choice in who you have to hang out with than you did before. I mean, at least in some of the hunter-gatherers we know, it's pretty easy to leave one band and join another. But if you have a farm, you're kind of anchored. You can't, it's worth something, but you can't just give it up because you may not be able to get another one. It probably involves more planning for the future. Look, humans have always had some planning for the future, but there's certain key things in agriculture such that you say, if you're someplace like Europe and it's March, you've used up most of your stuff you stored up over the winter. Not much new stuff has started growing, or the cows are not yielding milk yet. It's a tight time, but it's vital that you not eat the seed you've stored to plant, which is not quite time yet. You have to show self-control, and says it's better to go hungry then than to starve to death later in the year. And you might have to save, it depends where you were, but a number like a fifth of all the grain you harvest have to be saved for seed is kind of a normal number. And that's actually in a fairly favorable place. That's the sort of number you used to see in France in medieval times. And France has a lot of pretty decent farming country. In Russia, it was a third in a lot of places. It was, you have to take the future seriously. You have to, and there are other things which, probably have a lot of complicated impacts that I don't think we've thought about it hard enough, but having property that you can accumulate and, at least in many cases, hand down to your descendants, that's a different way to affect fitness than is usually possible for a hunter-gatherer. I mean, so it's a different disease environment. Probably the simplest reason it's different disease is because you're crowded. You're more crowded. And also you're static. So, the poop piles up, you're exposed, you can avoid a lot of problems if you just keep moving all the time, but these guys can't. So it's very different. Now,
Yeah, that's a good point.
some
That's a good point.
kinds of hunter-gatherers might have been a bit closer. There have been hunter-gatherers that had really predictable and kind of large resource flows, like the guys who lived off salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And
Yeah.
you could have a lot of people could be fed by those salmon runs. You could have villages and things, even if you weren't farming, and they mostly weren't. So one bias we have today, which is kind of inevitable, is the few places that we either have hunter-gatherers or did until recently tend to be crappy places that nobody else wanted.
Yeah, Monveer Singh's written about this.
It may be that the places where most of humanity lived were in unusually favorable places for hunter-gatherers, and maybe at least some of them had some of the issues closer to what farming is like. I'm not sure. But farming was a big change in terms of disease environment. It was a big change in terms of having to deal with more people, denser people you couldn't walk away from. For things where you needed to you needed to plan and act as if a year from now is just as real as tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not saying hunter-gatherers never had to think about that. If they never have, they might not have been able to start agriculture. But I think they did it less. I would guess, again, I'm guessing to some extent, that hunter-gatherers, one of the long-term things they had to plan about was things like getting along with people, making long-term friendships, long-term alliances, saying, we always got, my brother married that other family. We get along pretty well. I mean, I think there was planning, or at least thought about the future and things like that. But in a lot of, they weren't modifying their environment so much they had to plan exactly how they were doing it. Roughly speaking, I mean, something like that. So, be going from hunter-gatherer to farmer is a very big change. And one thing that, any good book on natural selection will say is if you put a population in an environment that is, let's say, about as different as they can still survive in.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a limit. You can't suddenly drop them on the moon. But if you put them in a very different environment, but it is possible to survive, they will change. You will get lots of selection on whatever matters in this new environment. And that happens all the time. But again, since that is not really taught, although I think it's getting better, that wasn't something that occurred to a lot of people in molecular biology and human medical genetics as saying, like they didn't say, well, of course people would change if you put them in a wildly new environment. Like to me, of course, what my excuse is, since when I was in grad school, I was reading Jackson Electromagnetics, but see, I cheated. I went out and I read books, which apparently, people trying to chase grants don't have time for. So,
yeah.
But the lesson I got from my reading in natural selection is, well, that's just bound to happen. You're bound to just change wildly if you drop a species into a quite different but survivable environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I said they're bound to change in all sorts of ways. And some people said, well, you can't select for behavior. I said, well, of course you can. I mean, since people do it all the time. So there would be things that people would say, well, that's theoretically impossible. I said, well, since people do it all the time, I don't really have to take that argument seriously. Or there were lots of odd things that people would bring up. Well, that's highly polygenic, so you can't select on it. I said, or it's very slow or whatever. So there was that article in The Guardian by the guy who writes Wiring the Brain.
Oh, Kevin Mitchell.
Yeah, he wrote a long article, and one of the things he was saying is, well, it would be really hard to select for more or presumably less intelligence because it's highly polygenic. I said, it is highly polygenic. He says, what does that have to do with how difficult it is to select on? He says, it does nothing. I said, where'd you get that idea? Someone made it up. Reich ran into that. He was talking about some guy who was saying, oh, but isn't it hard to select on highly polygenic things? And Reich, who, as I said, Reich didn't learn this as an undergraduate, but he learned it because he was a smart guy who was interested. I say he didn't learn it as an undergraduate because he was a physics major too. But he said, "Oh, it doesn't make any difference. Why? It's a myth." I certainly see a number of people on Twitter and other places on the internet says, "Well, it's really hard to select." I said, "The problem you're talking about is imaginary. It does not exist. It's your formulas for selection don't even take into account typically the number of loci involved."
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
said, "You're
Well,
just
I mean,
wrong."
agricultural breeding happens. It works,
Well, let me give another. A friend of mine who I should give a call because I haven't talked to him in a while, who was at one point a postdoc in anthropology, but in spite of that, knew quite a bit of genetics. Uh, he was talking to a person from Davis who was in agricultural genetics, and she was astonished that anyone other than an agricultural genetics major knew anything about quantitative selection. Her assumption was, if you had somebody, like, let's say in Coop's group, and you were talking about quantitative selection, they would not know anything about it at all.
Yeah.
And that probably is not wildly wrong. Although, again, I think it's getting better. You might know something about this that I don't, in the sense of are people putting it in the curricula, or are people just saying, "Look, I have this vast flood of interesting data come in, and I was forced to learn some theory, and we also hired a theory guy because I want to make something of all this data." Because that struck me as a very big part of the story. But I'm wondering, has there been, like, if a fresh guy comes out with a PhD in molecular biology, do they do anything more to teach him anything about natural selection than they used to? Which they used to, it was close to zero.
So there is look, I know for graduate school, at least a decade ago at UC Davis, if you're in the genetics program, they have a quantitative genetics, pretty much. I mean, it's split between quantitative and population genetics. It's a term, and then so that would be like 4 weeks of each, I think.
Sorry, but that's better.
Yeah.
But as I understand it, like, if they're giving you a qual and you're kind of doing poorly on your pop gen, they will pass you if you can prove you're a communist. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Are we thinking of a particular person?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously there's this whole field of population genetics that has existed, and people aren't leveraging it until recently, until genomics, where it's when we were started talking, it's we started talking on the phone. So today, like you just mentioned offhand, because I turned the video on for a little while we were recording that. I look really old. Well, we started talking when I was 25 years ago.
Yes.
And we had like a couple of human genomes probably around then. We didn't have that many human genomes. Now we have thousands of thousands of tens of thousands of human. Actually, we have millions of modern ones probably sequenced somewhere at some degree of sequencing.
Right.
And we have we have thousands of ancient ones. So we have so much more data to go off of. And so I guess in terms of 10,000 year explosion, you made a lot of predictions, and I feel like you felt validated by a lot of the predictions, right? But
not all, but most.
Most. Okay, so we there's agriculture, consequences of agriculture, gene flow expansions. You were writing at a time when it wasn't entirely clear that people, not pots, were moving, right?
Well, it depended. I mean, that's another. When I feel moderately critical of people for not having done all the things I think they should have in human genetics, I feel ever so much more critical of people in archaeology. The idea that you never had populations conquering, wiping out, or partially wiping out. That was when you see a new layer of tools, that's because the previous population has learned to make a new set of tools, which, by the way, obviously happens sometimes, right? But they're saying, well, that's always what happens. And you would end up with people saying, we do not believe that any Anglo-Saxons actually landed in England.
Yeah.
Okay. Guy says, hey, have you ever thought of walking over to East Sussex and looking at those people?
Yeah.
Comparing them to somebody up in Glasgow?
Yeah. Yeah.
I said, like, you notice something as simple as they're more blondes?
Yeah.
Or that, that people are more likely to look like Alicia Cuthbert?
Yeah.
Oh, not all of them, or the place we'd all have to call.
No, that's a dated reference to the actress that was in the original act, blonde woman in 24. And actually, I think Saint Cuthbert was an Anglo-Saxon saint, so I mean it's apropos. But then, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
But they said many things like that. I mean, I collected certain articles talking about mocking people for me believing in migrationism because I think they're funny. But now I can't claim. Truthfully, a lot of these questions, there were certainly points in my life I was not thinking about them at all. Now, if somebody said, "Do you think it's like impossible for some bunch of barbarians to conquer someone?" I said, "Well, since we know quite a bit like that happened at various times in historical times, like Goths and Vandals and Huns and Avars, and I said, I guess I don't see why it would be impossible in prehistoric times, but that is the conclusion that the archaeological community came to."
Yeah.
I mean, it says, like in a very rough way, they said, well, we were revolted at what happened in World War II, and we decided all those things that happened in World War II must be impossible. I said, that's a weird conclusion. And me said, I don't like X, so that proves it never happened in the past, even though there's enormous documentation of it. I said, are you crazy? And the answer was yes, they were crazy. It would be interesting. I probably have not followed it enough or do not know the right people to see the extent to which archaeologists have reacted, like on certain questions, like the Indo-European expansions, that how archaeologists are readjusting their thoughts, if at all. I don't really know. Do you have? Do you know much about how they're reacting to a bunch of outsiders pulling the rug out from under them? I mean, normally
I think a lot of them. A lot of them were. Yeah, a lot of people were like pretty annoyed. They went through denialism. They didn't really understand the methods and stuff like that for a while. But now I think like basically, at some point you just have to give up the ghost. And I think they have. Like they're starting to, integrate. I mean, well, yeah. That's fair. That's fair enough. But I mean,
I can tell you what it reminds me of a lot, which I think is parallel. Most paleontologists were taught that biological change, etc., is always gradual.
Yeah.
And the ultimate reasons for that was rejecting explanations involving the flood, things of that sort. And when the Alvarezes, particularly Alvarez Sr., came in and, apparently effortlessly showed they were wrong in every single thing they'd ever said about the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
They didn't like him. Out of some perverse feeling, I read 4 or 5 books by opponents of Alvarez, people like Dewey McLean, Donald Prothero, and they were not happy. Well, they didn't have anything useful to say, really, other than things that turned out to be wrong, but they were not happy. And I think some of them still haven't changed their mind. Like Gerda Keller was involved in this. They said, well, but, it's got to be difficult for anybody to have somebody come in and you spent most of your professional life on a certain set of things, and people say, well, most of you were just wrong. Now, if it's Louis Alvarez, he'll also say, well, probably because you were an idiot. By the way, I'm not saying he was wrong, but he was not one to try to smooth everything over all the time. They were idiots. I mean, I would read these books by people like Prothero, and I'm saying, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. Why? Because he isn't really very good. Lots of people aren't. But the archaeologists, it would be interesting to see. Now, clearly, some of them have adjusted to it. And now the linguists have not had to adjust to it because they were right. And it would be interesting to see, because you could say, well, part of the thing going on with the archaeologists was, well, like, we don't want X to be true. Let's say X is people now and then are prone to invasion and extermination.
Yeah.
Say, well, I don't really want that to be true either, but it is true because it has happened. But they seem to think if you just convince everybody, it would somehow, I don't know, it would have some sort of positive effect if you convince people of a past that was a lot more kumbaya than it really was.
Yeah.
But they're wrong. But the point is, they still are going to think, maybe they'll come up with some other reason, like, maybe people, maybe, like we know that in Spain, say about 2000 BC, the population was descended from a mix of local hunter-gatherers and a big chunk of ancestry from, again, the Neolithic farmers to the east. There was no steppe ancestry there. There were no steppe Y chromosomes at that point.
Yeah.
And then about 200 years later, it's 40% steppe ancestry, and the Y chromosomes are 100% steppe.
Yeah.
And that sounds to me like it was a bad place to be if you were a local guy. I figure and it's worse than people want to say. I said, is it true that, some Indo-European groups moved in and killed all the men in Spain? I said, they killed all the boys too.
Yeah.
I mean, they had to. It was bad. But that's what happened. I mean, so, I mean, people said, well, let's avoid that. I said, I'm with you. Let's not do that. But I've never understood quite what they thought they were doing by, trying to make violence in prehistory just go away by talking shit. I don't know what they were doing. So your take, I mean, I certainly know some of them that have adjusted. Oh, yes, but here was the question. Well, you could sort of see why they wanted. I mean, there were guys. What was the Australian who wrote this book, The Aryans, back in 1929?
I don't remember.
But it was a good book. He had the general outline of what had happened about Indo-European. He didn't have all the dates. He had the general outline of what had happened in Europe.
Wait, is this Gordon Kildee?
Yes, him. Yes.
I didn't know he was Australian. Okay.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, but yes.
Was.
Yeah.
Is, whatever the word is.
Yeah. Well,
He's dead.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not his fault. It's been a long time. Anyhow, but it was a good book. And he did not have all the data you would have today in the sense of, hey, there's been more archaeology, but probably most important dating methods like carbon-14 and so forth. But he had the central pattern of a bunch of slightly shorter sort of gracile guys from the Middle East with farmers first, and then we have a bunch of guys, he said, probably out of the Russian grasslands. He was pretty good about this. But later, he stopped talking about it entirely.
Yeah.
Because the circles he were in didn't like it. And they liked it less after the Nazis. This was before the Nazis. This was 1929. But the Nazis were saying, well, you had these fierce conquering Aryans. I said, well, you did, except they didn't start in Germany. But they existed. They were probably worse than you say.
Yeah.
But the interesting point is, I mean, so there were these pressures to not validate a prehistory that sounded very violent, and also violent in a way that sounded kind of like a Nazi talking. Okay.
Yeah.
But somehow they didn't have any effect on the linguists. I would have thought that in academia they would have felt the same pressures, and if they did, they just said, well, shit, we don't give a shit. As far as I can tell, they got things reasonably accurate, and and the outside pressures to come up with something that sounded, again, more kumbaya-ish, they apparently didn't even know they existed. Maybe they were in a part of the building that nobody else went. But the Indo-Europeanists, among the linguists, they did an I mean, now that we have found the exact place where, at a county resolution level, where the Indo-Europeans started up, halfway up the Volga, between the Urals and the Caspian Sea, that's almost exactly where they would have told you. I mean, some place that is not too far from people speaking Finnish-related languages because of the cross loans and things. That go
Yeah. What Greg is alluding to is that Finnic languages have borrowings from Indo-European languages, obviously, but there is a subset of borrowings that are clearly Indo-Iranian. So that indicates Indo-Iranians interacted with the ancient Proto-Uralic, the Proto-Finnic people. And that would be the Semi-Turbino culture, which is basically in the Central Urals region, right north of where the Sintashta were. So that was a contact zone.
But it looks like it must have been even earlier, because some of these loan words are earlier than, they're not Indo-Iranian, they're from some earlier time. And it suggested whatever the homeland of the Indo-Europeans was, it probably bordered on some group of people speaking, something in that Finno-Ugrian family. And the point is, that's probably exactly right. But there are, anyhow, talk about other things I got wrong or right in the book. I thought, that adaptation to drinking milk efficiently as adults, lactose tolerance, might have had something to do with the Indo-European expansion, and I was probably wrong.
Yeah, that's ancient DNA. Ancient DNA has shown that it was just really recent.
Well, the origin might actually go back to that population.
Yes, it does seem to. Yeah. One of the the variant.
But it was low frequency, so it wasn't a real important ecological advantage. Not in those days. Now, I mean, it probably was in, say, medieval Denmark or something.
Yeah.
Because but a lot of the increase is more recent. What else? I mean, the general arguments that we were making, that a lot of things had happened because people had changed a lot since agriculture, and changed in certain general directions, such as more resistance to disease, probably more forethoughtful, probably, living in a more complicated life, it was useful to be smarter.
Yeah.
Now, there are some things that are implicit that I did not say that I should have said, but if you'd asked me, I would have said, sure. Which one is? It looks as if, from this Al Akbari work, that the fastest changes were probably early in farming.
Yeah.
But, when you're put in a totally alien environment, all right, substantially alien, that's when you expect the change to be the most rapid, is in the very beginning, because your mismatch from what would work the best is the biggest.
Yeah.
But I think there's another point in that, which is, so when they show change happening, evolutionary change, directional selection, it is fastest in this European stuff in the early Neolithic. It doesn't entirely go away. For example, when the Indo-Europeans, who have not gone through most of that, conquer, your numbers drop, but then they go back again. Selection is pushing it back up to the, in the, once you become a farmer. And that apparently happens twice, with the dark age from the Indo-European conquest, but also from the one, with the fall of Rome.
Yeah.
You see it in the curves. It looks like that. Oh, by the way, one caveat, which I'm not criticizing these guys. I think they did a great job in many ways, but there's got to be more to find out on looking at a more fine-grained thing, more fine-grained in time, but also in space. They're kind of looking at overall European trends. And I'm sure there's interesting things that happen more in some places than others.
Yeah.
Like one of my favorites, and I think you would, if you had to bet, you wouldn't bet against me on this, is I wouldn't be, like, when they say these PRS scores for intelligence they look kind of similar in classical times to today.
Yeah.
Probably the time that is closest to today.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd really like to see them for the Ionian Greeks.
Yeah.
Because, they were exploding with ideas all the time. And, there were stereotypes that people had in, say, Roman times. And the stereotypes are not all wrong, was that Greeks are smart, but the Ionian Greeks are smarter.
Yeah.
And I can't actually think of any other group back in classical times where people said that of.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I said, sometimes things are the way they look. So if we got genotypes from, hey, we could look at all those bodies that were mass buried in the plague of Athens.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
So I think there's all sorts of sub things, and unrelated questions. Which did this happen everywhere? I said no. Did it happen in other places? I said probably yes. So there's a preliminary paper looking at trends in East Asia.
Yeah.
From this same Reich group. What was the name of the young lady who did this one?
I think that was Alison Barton.
Yeah,
I think she's the second. She's the second, or I think she's the second author on the Akbari paper.
When I don't know people, I don't always remember their their names, but I want them to get all deserved credit. So thank you for helping me with the name. That one. Now the problem with East Asia is we have fewer samples, but they did about a tenth as many or something like that.
Yeah.
But they tried to see if similar trends were happening, and as in Europe, and the answer appears to be in general yes.
Yeah.
There, I think I've stated the gist of the paper. Now, in times to come, we hope to know more. I mean, for example, like when we say agriculture, there's more than one kind of agriculture. For that matter, there are more than one kind of hunter-gatherers. But the selection pressures were probably not exactly the same. And for that matter, the populations that participated as hunter-gatherers were not exactly the same, but in every part of the world.
Yeah.
For example, as far as we know, the ancestors of Eskimos, and until very recently, where we built, started building grocery stores near their houses, the Eskimos were hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But on things like IQ scores, they come much closer to agriculturalists than other hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
Like, maybe around 90, which is not a rare number in the world.
Yeah.
And they have a different profile, which they tend to be very good at things like spatial visualization.
Yeah.
And that kind of seems like it might make sense for the sort of, but if anybody ever had, people have talked about cold winters. Did that have something to do with some groups making more civilizational progress than others? I said, I'm not sure. But with the Eskimo, I would bring up the cold summers theory. If it's cold all the time, and you're also surrounded by polar bears, maybe you have to really be on your toes to survive. I mean, like I would say, with the Eskimos, I mean, sure, they actually have to try to provision for different times of the year. But one thing is their way of life has an awful lot of risk in it.
Yeah.
Like if you get caught in a storm or you get caught and you're not ready for a polar bear, you'll be dead. I think it was, nobody is without risk, but I think they may have had more than some other populations. And most importantly, kinds of risk that you could do things about. I mean, for example, if your risk is being hit by a meteorite, what do you do? I mean, there isn't anything it doesn't select for anything except don't be there. But one of the things which I think in some sense this area would have benefited from was looking at the psychometric results worldwide. And they, it's fair to say they have averted their eyes.
Yeah.
And I said, well, if you don't believe in IQ, why are you using IQ PRS scores?
Yeah.
They said, well, we kind of do, but we don't want everybody to know that we do. Or, I mean, you probably know some of these people better than I do. If you had to guess, or if you know, what are they thinking? Why? Well, no. So, for example, another comment I heard, and I wonder what to think about it, that says both Reich and Al-Akbari were really surprised by these results. Okay, that's a quote, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Wait, okay, but I think what they were surprised by was the pervasiveness, the number of alleles, the number of selection events. I think what they're saying there is that, well, the previous tests looking for hard selective sweeps, didn't return much, right?
Tens of things that would be a high number compared to the long run of human prehistory, but not high enough to explain most of the things you see.
Yeah.
I mean, if you said we found 25 near complete sweeps or something like that, that's actually really high for a few thousand years.
Yeah.
But it's not enough to explain everything that you might want to explain. Oh, by the way, one of the things that I think these people have benefited of is they actually, absorbed people out of agricultural genetics and got, and all of a sudden, Peter Vischer, for example, and he said, "Oh yeah, we've been doing that for years. I know how to do that." Everybody know what's your problem? I mean, I'm imagining what he was saying, but it was, he made useful contributions very rapidly, I think. Although, again, I see this in aerospace. There's this weird other possibility which people don't want to use. You see, they would rather hire a guy who knows how to do X than read a book. Which just, I said, well, it's not a bad thing. Particularly, perhaps not everything is actually published, but you could read a book. I think. So, I mean, if I can think of plenty of books on natural selection that if people had in the Reich lab led them, they said, well, selection on something that's polygenic. Which of the variants start increasing that of the ones that boost the phenotype in the direction that works better? I said, well, kind of all of them. I said, so a lot of people say, well, must get the impression it's really hard for selection to do anything. I said, a better analogy is you have a pool table and you tilted it. How many of the balls roll over to the side? All of them. Like it looks like when they talk about PRS scores for IQ, they're talking about well over 100 variants that have been creeping up. Throw away the top 40 and the bottom are still creeping up. And they have, and apparently every gene that makes your skin lighter and doesn't kill you has been slowly increasing. I mean, some of them more than slowly. Now, it's, I don't know. I said, if you talk to an agricultural geneticist, I think that's what they would have told you. And there's no law that says you can't. Although, actually, one thing about Harvard that I now suspect, I haven't thought about it, like when I went to the University of Illinois, we had an ag department. And you could tell when the wind was from the south. But we also had people who knew agricultural genetics. There were long-term selection experiments. There was something called the Morrow plots that were right next to the undergraduate library, and they'd been selecting for different things in corn for 90 years. We had people who really knew this stuff. And I'm kind of wondering if Harvard did. I'm thinking, Harvard might not have a bunch of pigs down on the south end of the campus. I know it's hard to believe. How can it be considered a university? But I wonder if that had something to do with it. And today, some of these ideas would have seemed very natural to the average American of 100 years ago, because the average American of 100 years ago was probably still a farmer or close. And today, they're not. So there's all sorts of things. People said, well, how could X happen? I said, how could anything else happen? Would be a more reasonable thing to say. Anyhow, go ahead.
Well, okay. So I guess the last thing I want to talk about, before we close out this podcast, which, it's a little weird. Like, we do talk every now and then, like less than I used to, partly because I got stuff going on in my life, but so the Ashkenazi stuff. You guys had a hypothesis about Ashkenazis, their IQ and all that stuff. This was actually a period when we didn't know nearly as much about Ashkenazi origins as we do now. Like right now, we pretty much know that Ashkenazis seem to have emerged as a distinct population with their genetics, probably in the 13th century, that there was a Western Ashkenazi proto-Ashkenazi population, which, had the traditional Ashkenazi liturgy. So, the Rabbi Rashi, for example, was of this group. And the Yekis, who are distinct Rhineland Jew with their own liturgy. And they stood as a Yeki temple in New York. That are distinct from the main Ashkenazis, who seem to be a mixture of this group moving eastward into central Germany in the 13th century, and then another group that seems to have moved to the west, probably out of Moravia, modern Czech Republic, something like that. The second group may have been speaking some sort of Judeo-Slavic language. They were probably not Germanic-speaking, although we're not sure. And also, they had considerably more Eastern and Northern European ancestry than the Western group. The Western group is much like much more like what Sephardic Jews were like before Sephardic Jews received about 30% Moorish Jewish DNA during the Islamic period, which, so that's a confusing thing. The Sephardic Jews changed under the period of Muslim rule, and so when you compare modern Sephardic Jews to the Yekis or these old genotypes from Western Europe before 1200, they don't quite look exactly the same, and it's because the Moorish Jewish ancestry makes the modern Sephardic Jews distinct. But in any case, you have these two groups come together. They have this Ashkenazi culture, this Yiddish language, which, it's more from culturally, they're much more dominated by the Western Jews that are coming out of the Rhineland, but genetically, it's like about 40%, I think, the Eastern Jews, so it's substantial. So this is the origin of the Jews. Now, Jews have higher IQs on average, depending on which IQ test, like somewhere between like 110, 115. So like 2/3 to one single standard deviation above the white, Northern European norm. Their cognitive profile is a little different, as you point out in the book, I think, and elsewhere, about like half a standard deviation lower when it comes to the visual spatial IQ. They tend to be more verbally oriented, verbal loading on their IQ. In any case, those are just the facts. You present a thesis about how it emerged and issues related to genetic architecture and other things. I think this is basically an adaptation of your paper with Henry Harpending, like was it Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence, right? Which came out
right.
A while ago. What year was that?
5 or 6.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was 2005. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, and that is, that was like 3 or 4 years before this. Yeah, 2006 is when it was published. September of 2006 in Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence. Greg Cochran, Jason Hardy, and Henry Harpending, Journey of Biosocial Science. What do you think about like the last 17 years now since then? Like, what do you think about your thesis and all that?
I think we have more evidence. There are a few not huge, but not useless. There were subpopulations of other groups where we have Jewish PRS scores.
Yeah.
Like they'd have 50 or 100 people. So, you're starting to get where you want to get. And they had elevated PRS scores. Now, that is from, the standing variation, essentially, probably, most of it. Okay. Yeah. We were talking about specific things. By the way, I always thought it was mostly standing variation, although I think I should have emphasized that more. In the sense, when I would do calculations about, how much gene flow you could tolerate and still select for a given group, that implicitly is a highly polygenic model. But at any rate, so you could say, there are different layers of hypothesis. The big hypothesis is the Ashkenazi Jews have higher IQs because of selection. A sub-hypothesis, which could be right or wrong, would be, did certain genes have anything to do with it? As opposed to, so the many funny neurological Mendelian disorders in Ashkenazi Jews, were they part of that story? I'd say we don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they were, though, but nobody's ever looked. All sorts of people explain to me that people have looked, but no one has. Because in all the populations where you might have access, nobody wanted to deliberately collect the data. And so rather, certain people did, but it was explained to them that they would get into deep trouble if they tried.
Yeah.
But in terms of accidentally collecting the data, things like UK Biobank, they have a threshold. Things have to be common enough before they put them they start recording them. And since the population frequency of Jews in England is only about 0.5% instead of 2% like the US, and then you multiply by, something whose carrier frequency is 2% like Tay-Sachs, it's below the threshold. Nobody looked at any of them.
Yeah.
It's the distribution into neurological type things, and in particular, a couple of branches, in particular, the sphingolipid compounds.
Yes.
It's real suspicious. But for example, if it turned out all of it was just, the typical alleles that involve a PRS score, I said, at least most of it is.
Yeah.
I said, why? Because the fraction of Jews that carry any of those well-known kind of funny neurological mutations is only about 20%. It's not, it could be a part of the story. We thought and again, you're trying to think of what was accessible with the data of the time.
Yeah.
I said, now, does that happen with strong selection? Sure, all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it happened, it would have probably been a hint that the selection for intelligence was stronger than in most populations.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
people said, well, it's against the laws of physics for a given mutation to make you smarter,
Yeah.
even if it has some side effects. And I said, probably it's not, but it doesn't seem to happen
Yeah.
very often. I
Yeah.
mean, there are lots of traits that, there are traits that we got to learn anything about because of the particular examples, particular alleles with strong effects. So we
Yeah.
saw things like sickle cell in Africa. Okay, and
Yeah.
that's a strong effect because it makes homozygotes very sick. Okay,
Yeah.
but does that mean most of the first, a fact, Africans are a lot more resistant to falciparum malaria than, let's say, Norwegians. Lots more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect? No, but lots more. Okay, is
Yeah.
most of that difference from sickle cell? No. Well, how much of the variance is due to sickle cell? Not very much. I mean, when
Yeah.
people have looked at it, they said most of the resistance in Africans is lots of other alleles that are either harmless or at least they don't cause any noticeable disease. And
Yeah.
now, so if you go back far enough, we only know 2 or 3 alleles like sickle cell, thalassemia, things like that. Now we know many others that don't by themselves cause obvious illness, but they're clearly the reason they're common is this. So, for example, one example is before birth, people make a different kind of hemoglobin, fetal hemoglobin,
Yeah.
and it has its greater affinity for oxygen, so it can sort of help take oxygen away from the mom to the baby.
Yeah.
That's its purpose. Well, there
Yeah.
are places in Africa where, and so normally you stop making it after you're born, and you just make regular hemoglobin. But there are places where people might still have 10% of their blood might be fetal hemoglobin.
Yeah.
Fairly common mutations that do things like that in parts of Africa. And they said, why? Well, I don't think we've done lots of experiments giving people falciparum malaria to check this out in every detail, but it looks like the falciparum parasite doesn't know what to do with the fetal hemoglobin, and it means you've got at least, say, 10% of your hemoglobin is okay and immune to the effects of malaria, and that's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and that's probably a more high profile than there's probably all sorts of things that make, a 2% difference in your protection against malaria. I mean, the statistics indicate there's a lot of invisible stuff, but that could happen for lots of things. But both things are possible. Like in most of the populations we see today, IQ seems to, I'll compare it with skin color. In Europeans, there are 2 or 3 alleles that make a difference you can see by eye, whether you have one or not, like SLC24A5.
Yes.
Okay. But then there's a very long tail of things which are measurable, but you could not, the effects are smaller down to very small.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Selection boost. Which of those were boosted by selection in Europe? All of them.
Yeah.
So you have a few fairly big ones and a long tail.
Yeah.
With IQ, all we know about in the populations we've looked at, in current populations, is the long tail.
Yeah.
Now, is it possible that now and then there are bigger effect ones? I said they would be more likely to happen if the selection were stronger. Is it possible? I said, it's possible. There's nothing impossible about it. People said, well, you just couldn't have a single mutation that made you be a lot smarter. I said, I don't know that. Mind you, I don't have one that I know of.
Yeah.
I know 1 or 2 that are kind of suspicious. And some of these Ashkenazi ones are kind of suspicious. But nobody has ever looked at them in any great detail. And they don't want to, which is interesting. Like, I knew somebody who wanted to, let's find all the people who are Tay-Sachs carriers at Harvard and compare them with their siblings.
Yeah.
And to which his advisor said, well, if you want to get me in trouble and you personally want to become an unemployable pariah, quote, unquote, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the way, the advisor was not hostile to the idea, and I'm sure would have been curious to see the result, but not that curious.
Yeah.
Or there was somebody else who was interested in Israeli evolutionary biologist after our paper, Henry and I's paper. He said, well, we can look at the draftees. We can get samples. We'll nail this. I said, we'll either prove it or disprove it. I said, that's my kind of guy. I like hearing people talk like that. He said, we can nail this coonskin to the wall. He didn't actually say that, but that was his spirit if he had been an American. And then he talked to some people and they said, why do you want to know?
Yeah.
They didn't want to do it. They said, why? And they didn't want to do it for a different reason than in the United States, slightly different.
Yeah.
They thought that it wouldn't be true of all the Jewish populations. Like they say, so we see these in Ashkenazi. Are we going to see them in the Yemenite Jews?
Yeah.
The answer is probably not.
Yeah.
And we don't want to know. It's against official policy. I said, it's a similar argument, but it's not the same argument that would apply. That's the driving one in the United States. But of course, I probably start out with a viewpoint that says, people say, so you have this higher IQ. Where do you think it came from? I mean, they say, oh, it's eating gefilte fish, to which I'd say, gee, I don't know if it's worth it. Or they say, oh, it's because, the special way we raise your kids. I said, it's really not. Could you at least say whatever it is you're doing? Because nobody else knows, even you.
Yeah.
I've known smart Jewish guys and their father ran a gas station. And I said, and he said, well, and didn't you learn a lot of pill pull and Talmudic reasoning? He says, among the American Jews who have tended to be prominent in things like science and math, I can think of one or two that were raised Orthodox, but not very many.
Yeah.
Chomsky, I think, was.
Yeah.
But what was Feynman doing in high school? I said reading a calculus book, but doing traditional Jewish things, nothing, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
I mean, Feynman couldn't even occasionally recognize Jewish guys he was working with. Oh, you're Jewish? Von Neumann? Who knew? I remember thinking, really? I mean, I could do that. Maybe, at least better than, Feynman. Feynman was weirder than the popular culture. I mean, says he was brighter in some ways and actually not very good in other ways. That except for chasing women all the time, he was he would have been an incel if he wasn't a philanderer. Something like that. I don't know how to say it. I know when he applied to Princeton, he had to take various tests, admission tests. He had the highest score they had ever had in math and science, and physics. He had the lowest score. He had a score not the lowest in the world, but lower than anyone they had ever admitted in other things like literature and English usage and stuff like that. I mean, which probably meant he was like 40th percentile for the general population or something.
Yeah. But he was a bit of a Philistine.
He was, I don't think I'm not sure by the way, I'm not sure you're wrong either, but I kind of think maybe he was not as good at those things. It's not, in general, people, their abilities kind of track together, but not 100%. So you could, and then at least the places I would see this would be in engineering. Like there'd be guys who says, oh yeah, I got 98th percentile on math and I got 60th on verbal.
Yeah.
And I said, I said, most of the people, that I know better would do very close to the same on both, but you don't have to. It's an average tendency. Feynman was not somebody who did exactly as well in both kinds of subjects. For example, on his books, you know what his secret was to writing them? Which one I recommend to everybody, although I did not take this path. Somebody else write them.
Okay.
He didn't write any. He never wrote a book. But
I see.
People who said, "Oh, this is a digest of his." I talked with him about X and so on. He did talk with them, but he didn't write the book. It was Ralph Layton, etc. I mean, and at least he had something interesting to say some of the time. I mean, the official books. These are the thoughts of presidential candidate X, who actually is illiterate, but that's how ghostwriters make a living. That's it was a little bit different from that. But at any rate, back on the Ashkenazi question. We now have some PRS scores, which kind of, I think, said, geez, it's like they're kind of, 2/3 of the standard deviation higher. That's kind of what the
Yeah.
PRS, I said, which is what? Oh, there is one fact associated with this, which also matters a lot for all these talk about have people gotten smarter since the Mesolithic.
Yeah.
Well, two things. One is when I said things were changing a lot in the beginning,
Yeah.
a better picture of what the beginning was like, let's say pre-agriculture, is probably the Western hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
And the difference between them and moderns is about 2.3 standard deviations in that paper.
Yeah. Wait, the difference is what?
Between the Western hunter-gatherers in Europe on the IQ PRS and modern people is 2.3 standard deviations.
Oh, that's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot.
It is. But I'm saying, see, these early farmers, they had already been farmers for a while. And since it looks like the change is fastest in the beginning, being even 3,000 or 4,000 years into farming means you're a different person than a true random hunter-gatherer.
Yeah.
And when people do psychometrics on people like Australian Aborigines, they get numbers that are, not wildly different from those suggested for those Western hunter-gatherers. They're low. I mean, they're more than 2 standard deviations low. So I wanted to say that. But the other thing which affects all of this is, the fraction of people who are smart enough to do certain interesting things varies very strongly with the average.
Yeah.
So if you have an average IQ, let's say of Europe of 100 today, and let's say that in the Bronze Age it was only 90, that's enough to make all sorts of, there'll be interesting things that happen today that just barely happened at all, or zero back then, because the fraction of people with an IQ, let's suppose the threshold's 130 or something. Well, the fraction of people who will be over that threshold is much higher today. I mean, so the fraction, a change in the mean of a certain amount can enormously change the fraction of how many people go over a certain threshold. And if you assume that, like, we want to do things like invent math, like, why couldn't math have been invented in the Neolithic? I said, I don't think there were enough smart people to do it.
Yeah.
Now, in the Greek times, there were probably just barely enough.
Yeah.
They did it.
Yeah.
And then in the Middle Ages, it was almost dead.
Yeah.
Not everything was lost, but not much progress was happening.
Yeah.
I said, but we know those scores go down. Now, there are other factors involved. There's things like it's probably harder to concentrate on this if you're facing a barbarian invasion. If your life is more uncertain, if people are seizing all your crops. There's many other factors, but you can get dramatic differences. And one related thing also, and these changes were not just in cognitive things, but like the risk of schizophrenia has been going kind of steadily down since the beginning of this study. The risk of bipolar has been going steadily down. Now, it's probably only changed the standard deviation, but that means there were a higher fraction of crazy people given the same stresses, say, or whatever. And one of the things that I was thinking about fairly recently is I was commuting a little bit, and some of my commute was there's some sort of empty country. And so I was letting myself listen to an audiobook. I was listening to the Iliad.
Yeah. Yes, that's good. Yeah, that should be listenable, right?
Well, one would hope so. Now, mind you, I am a normal human being. I only listen to it in English, not in archaic Greek. I'm not no better than I should be. But I came away with a conclusion, which people know. I said, those guys were idiots. I mean, the famous guys in the Iliad, their ideas of tactics were not as sophisticated as mine when I was 10 years old. And their ability to hold their temper and plan for the future. I mean, some of them could do it, but a whole lot of important ones were terrible at it. I said, they sound, I think the right word for these people is perhaps old-fashioned. Because I think when you go back in time, people were different, and that's one of the ways. I think they were more likely to hear voices.
Yeah, for sure. against Julian Jane stuff, right?
Well, except I think he put it into his problem. He was trained as a psychiatrist, which is a bad. No one should be trained as a at least not his kind of psychiatrist.
Yeah.
But in a very fundamental way, said if he's saying people were different.
Yeah.
Now I think I could give you a better characteristics in about one sentence than his, but his fundamental idea, these people were different, I think he was right. But I would say it this way. They were dumb, short-sighted, and crazier. What do I think about Achilles? I said, I think he's an asshole. And I think he's kind of a fool.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, Agamemnon. I said, why is he picking a stupid fight with his one of his key guys?
Yeah.
Or when you read about tactics, I see like one case where people did tactics, and that's the sort of tactics you could use would have been sort of common in 6th grade.
Yeah.
Where one of the Trojan allies does not have scouts out at night.
Yeah.
Odysseus notices this.
Yeah.
And so he and one of his buddies go and kill about 15 of them in the middle of the night. This is why. Well, because that way I could weaken my opponent without taking too much risk of getting killed, which that whole sentence is like alien to everybody else, or not everybody else, but most of the people in the Iliad. They're just idiots. Hot-headed, stupid. Odysseus is like, a random sort of modern guy dropped into the middle of the story.
Yeah.
Which is also true in the Odyssey.
Yeah. He's got superpowers of genius because he is like, that's a superpower,
Yeah, he's almost as far-looking as the average Midwestern farmer I grew up with, maybe more. I mean, he's a cool guy, but does most of the things, that his surroundings says, wow, look how clever he is. I said, yeah. I mean, I could do that. Now, mind you, I don't think I could string that bow and fire it through, all those empty axe handles. He was a tough dude as well. Okay.
Yeah.
And at other points, I'm probably a softie. I don't think I would have actually strangled all the maids. But, I'm not a 21st century guy. I'm a 20th century guy.
Yeah.
I sort of against that sort of thing. But anyhow, I think people have changed, which is something I said in the book. I thought people are different than they used to be. The other thing is, I said I think people in other parts of the world are also different. Like my guess is about pure-blooded Australian Aborigines is they're more like Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, because why would they be anything else?
Yeah.
What about population Y that has farming experience, but it's a different kind of farming and it's much shorter? I said, well, I don't have to come out exactly the same. It would be interesting to try to investigate this, because I'm sure the type of farming has effects, and I don't claim to understand them yet. Like getting complicated civilizations where, what was it, like in Jared Diamond, like somebody invents transistors and certain others, in New Jersey, in the United States, and European civilization, and certain other places pick it up, like in Japan or China. I said, but others just don't. And I said, yeah, I could have told you that, Jared. I said, but we don't know the reason. And we know that the only people who are smarter than average are the people in New Guinea. I said, yeah, I kind of think you're wrong about that, Jared. In fact, I think you've been drinking lots. But most of the things, like if people say, I expect a guy from X people there, at least some of them could do this complicated thing. And there's other places where no one's ever seen it happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And most of the people, people spend money, internalize that. Do they try to get lots of H-1B people from places where the average, even though they might speak English, let's say, do they try to get them from various places in Africa where you might think they could? Well, they don't.
Yeah.
They'd probably be cheaper than India. Why don't they ever try it? It says, they don't. Why? Well, but they don't think they could do it. You're probably right.
Yeah. Okay.
I
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
talked to a friend who works at a company that does software and stuff for people, the sort of people who, they go through the script and they help you figure out what's wrong with your laptop or something. And I said, so why don't you have more people in X, like out of this country? He said, because our estimate is there just aren't that many people who are up to doing it. We'd be happy to, but they don't. I mean, the market knows some things. By the way, if I'm wrong. Somebody found a way to start hiring people in Country X, and lots of people had made a decent living and so forth. I'm all for it, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah.
Places where these things don't migrate to. But I think when we look at it, we're going to find that the general story is mostly agriculture. There might be exceptions, at least partial exceptions. I'm thinking of the Eskimo. I'm thinking that the type of agriculture may end up mattering, slash and burn, where you're moving all the time, versus things like where you end up with staying in one place. That might actually be a pretty fundamental difference. I mean, I think that turning into a pastoralist and following your herds, that's a big difference from being a hunter-gatherer, but I don't know that all the evolutionary pressures that put to you are the same ones as when you become, a sit-down dirt farmer. I think, or the Ashkenazi, that's really a similar transition, I think, except it's called, what are you transitioning from? It's almost as different. So you're going from farming to white-collar work. I mean, if you thought of, if the Ashkenazi had come from India and didn't intermarry, and this is, what do we do? We're a scribe caste. That's kind of like what they ended up doing, except that's not their origin. But the endogamy is, it doesn't have to be at the founding, but during the period of selection, you have to have a high degree, because if you are frequently marrying with the people across the street, you will not be very different from them. It's not possible. Well, speaking of which, when we had people who were supposedly, professors and things, who were saying how the British had invented caste and jatis.
Yes.
Isn't it true that you can find places in India where there are guys living on the opposite side of the street that are in different jatis and look somewhat different?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure.
Well,
I mean, what I tell people is, like, the genetic distance is like Finnish to Italian within the same village.
I mean, they don't have medicals or anything, but they look somewhat different. Well, if people have been there for thousands of years, they should not look different from the people across the street. It takes fantastic. I mean, I would think of it as discipline. I said, you're saying there's a cute chick across the street and you didn't even go over and.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
3,000 years. But I mean, the Ashkenazi started out with a lot of mixing in their family. They have a lot of European ancestry. But then they were closed for a long time, or close to. And you can put numbers on this. How much intermarriage is possible while still having selection that makes you different or something? It's not much. Basically 2% is probably too much. 2% a generation. And the Ashkenazi, they have a lot of admixture, but as long as it happened early before the period of selection, it doesn't make any difference. It might have even been a good thing. I mean, maybe European genes. I mean, for all I know, the Europeans were a bit smarter than the Middle Easterners, or the same. I don't know. But anyhow, that it was selection, that it has something to do with endogamy. The endogamy is based on their customs. We pretty well know that. But it's also, to some extent, the customs of the people around them. I mean, if the people around them had been infinitely welcoming and said, hey, we think you're great guys and so forth, as opposed to being somewhat hostile, there would have been more intermarriage, probably. I mean, it wouldn't have been all that hard to get to the point where they completely dissolved into the rest of the population. But if you are in a special ecological niche, you are the white-collar guys. And the people who are better at white-collar things, and you're in the white-collar guys, but Carl Djerassi has not yet invented birth control.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, we have pretty good information that the Ashkenazi who were richer had more children.
Yeah.
I mean, there were
Yeah.
things they would do to discourage. There were some people who were poor and on a kind of inside the community welfare.
Yeah.
They very strongly discouraged them from getting married and having kids. I mean, I don't think they're perfectly effective, but they certainly tried. And now there is an alternate model, which it all has to do with giving huge rewards to people who did enormous amounts of Talmudic analysis. But I don't really believe it. But I think it was, people who were more successful at the white collar jobs and made money.
Yeah.
And I think that I see no real reason to take this back. I think some people have said, because we haven't found a lot or really any significant, positive, large effect IQ owls, that means they're impossible. I said, I will listen to you say that, but I don't think they're impossible. I mean, like if one happens, think of it in terms of trade-offs. What if there was something that made you smarter, let's say 5 points, but in most populations it did not succeed because you had to eat more?
Yeah.
Well, if you were the Ashkenazi Jews during the period we're talking about were fairly prosperous.
Yeah.
People usually compare them with the lower nobility.
Yeah.
Well, that means you could afford to eat a little extra.
Yeah.
I mean, if we found such a thing today that you would be healthier or smarter or better looking, and the horrible price was you would have to eat a bacon cheeseburger every other day.
Yeah.
I'm thinking you, Razib, out of your individualism and courage, would be willing to make that sacrifice.
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
If it made you live to 120 or, made girls chase you relentlessly or, you would man up and take that risk.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so could there be such trades? I said, yes, because lots of people, food has occasionally been short. So there might be trades in that direction. It doesn't prove that.
Yeah.
But it's not, I see no reason why it's theoretically impossible. I don't claim to know any right now. I know one or two things that make you wonder. I know a couple of Ashkenazi things that make you wonder, but nobody's looked, and I don't expect anybody to look. Not on those. Although, I mean, if we found a variant like this, and it existed in one little chunk of China, it was a recent variant, and the Chinese found it, they might talk about it.
Yeah.
Because it would be sort of decorrelated from all the controversial questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
In general, I don't have any reason to think that Ashkenazi Jews suddenly stopped being smart or that we found a different kind of reason that would explain it.
Yeah.
I think that the things like the sphingolipid mutations with Gaucher disease and so forth are not proven. And also, nobody's looked at them, and I'm not sure what will ever have happen. I do think, though, that there's pretty good evidence on the PRS scores, which could easily get better. And another thing which could very easily be done, but I have not seen it done, would be looking at admixture.
Yeah.
And although I've seen whenever anybody did anything and they came up with they always come up with the conclusions that you're not supposed to, and then everybody ignores them. I mean, for things like IQ, for medical stuff, like suppose I was looking at people who are part Polynesian Hawaiian ancestry in Hawaii, of which there are some people, and what if there was a admixture analysis that said, basically, the more Polynesian you are, the bigger your cardiovascular risk.
Oh, okay.
Well, that one has actually happened.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, but it is also the way things are.
Yeah.
Or if I say they look at things like obesity risk and diabetes risk and talk about various ethnic mixes, nobody talks about how, there's probably some magical thing screwing up the genetics, and so it means the opposite of what it says.
Yeah.
Now, if they did it on anything like IQ, they do say that.
Yeah.
You're asking, what do I think of some of the people who seem to spend much of their time trying to explain why these patterns don't exist? I said, I haven't seen anything really interesting and useful out of them. And if they did, I promise you I'd change my mind about them pretty rapidly.
Yeah.
So if there was
Yeah.
something which is like if somehow somebody like Gusev said, I've been thinking some evolutionary thoughts and I've gathered some data, and I think I can actually make a case for what's really going on with, let's say, menopause. I said, shit. I mean, because we certainly don't have any other explanation. I said, I'd give it a shot. I might not agree, but if it made sense, I'd say, I'm surprised it came from these people, but it makes me reevaluate them. But, I've never had to do that. Never,
Yeah.
never.
Yeah.
Oh, I will say one thing I was once reading by Graham Coop that I thought was interesting, although I thought it had an interesting implication, which he didn't carry it to. But he was talking about inefficient selection in Neanderthals because the population's too small, particularly some of the time at glacial maxima where life was really hard.
Yeah.
And he said, well, they must have been all messed up. I said, but it's funny that they weren't so messed up that when the weather got better, I mean, they weren't so messed up for a very long period that modern guys out of Africa could displace them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how messed up are they? And by the way, there are technical, interesting reasons. You can have selection for things that you might call salvage mutations in small populations. So they go into these problems more slowly than you might think. Interesting stuff. But I think there was one case where it's much stronger, and it happened, which is what is the real case, the very worst case where this small numbers kill you? Y chromosomes and mtDNA, because their effective population is 4 times smaller, and they don't recombine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you think about it, you would expect their Y chromosomes and mtDNA to be totally fucked up.
Yeah.
And they were. They both got replaced by just a little bit of admixture with humans. Something closer to the main line.
Yeah, it was close to our stem lineage. It was close to our stem lineage.
Maybe a quarter of a million years ago. But the reason we could never find, like when we find Neanderthal mtDNA, it seems closer than it should be, considering how long. They said it got replaced. The same thing for the Y chromosome. Now, that does not seem to have happened with the Denisovans. And I think the reason is there were a lot more Denisovans.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there are major parts of the world, even at glacial maxima. Like in some cases, would have had more room. Like Indonesia turns into a huge peninsula.
Yeah.
Glacial maxima there. I mean, so in places like Southeast Asia, like South China, like the Indonesia. Not absolutely. Do we yet know who it was? Was it Neanderthals or Denisovans in India? Do we know?
Probably Denisovans. There's like a lot of circumstantial evidence that there's a independent Denisovan admixture in India, in Indians. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, and again, that's a large inhabitable area.
Yeah.
So
anyway, we should all right. So we're going longer than 2 hours. 2 hours and 10. We should probably wind it down now. I don't normally do that, but I know how you are, Greg. Like we could do this 3 hours and then like at the but no, it was great catching up. Maybe we should do this some other time. But it's been a long time in coming. I hope the listeners really enjoy it. The perspective. The book is 10,000-Year Explosion: How Civilization Accelerated Human Evolution. It's on Kindle, audiobook, hardcover, paperback, whatever. It's been around for 17 years, so probably get it at a used bookstore too if you want. And your blog is West Hunt, which you originally
West Hunter, actually.
Hunter. You originally co-authored it with the late Henry Harpending, but now it's just you're just going. It was great catching up with you, and I will talk to you soon, man.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
This podcast for kids